This week on Jerusalem Dateline, it's official. President Trump signs an order recognizing Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. Plus, Hamas fires a missile deep inside Israel, sparking the latest round of violence between the terror group and the Jewish state. And an ancient Jewish village from the time of Jesus is discovered inside Jerusalem. All this and more this week on Jerusalem Dateline. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell. Once again, Israel and Hamas faced off in another round of violence. The conflict began when Hamas fired a rocket deep inside central Israel that destroyed a home and injured 7. Israel responded with attacks on Hamas targets inside the Gaza Strip, while Hamas fired dozens of rockets towards southern Israel. During the fighting, the IDF began preparing for what could be a broad military campaign inside Gaza. The border has been simmering for at least a year. At the end of March, Hamas marked a one-year anniversary of the so-called Great March of Return, an attempt to breach Israel's southern border. CBN News has covered what's happening on the border. And here's a story on both why Hamas is trying to breach Israel's southern border and what the IDF is doing to stop them. CBN News got a rare up-close look at the violence on the border of Hamas-controlled Gaza. We're standing just a few yards away from the Israel-Gaza border. This is the front lines of a more than 2-month battle between Hamas and the Israeli Defense Forces. Like many other places along the border, soldiers face deadly force.
Today we've had 3 grenades thrown at Israeli troops at this specific location.
It's not legitimate and civilian riot. The leaders of the riot is Hamas, and they are trying to challenge us.
This frontline commander said the IDF faces daunting military challenges defending its border.
If you take civilians and you put between them people to throw grenades and you put between them women and children, then you make us challenge all the time. But we have the rules of engagement.
Those rules include dropping leaflets the day before an expected demonstration warning Gazans to stay away from the fence. The next day, they used loudspeakers to keep people away.
أهالي غزة هنا جيش الدفاع الإسرائيلي المنطقة المحاذية من جدار الحدود محظورة لدخول المدنيين نطلب منكم أن لا ترسلوا نساءكم وأطفالكم إلى خط الأمامي. Then they shoot tear gas for those who approach the fence.
And after that, only shooting in the air. If they will try to cross the fence with using of cutters, using of burning tires, there will be no choice and they will have to shoot with snipers to the foot. And that's what we do before we use lethal weapon.
During our interview, the commander received word of a Hamas shooting.
The report now is that they shot at one of the forces that is from south to this spot.
A few hundred meters behind us is the kibbutz of Nachal Oz. For the soldiers who are deployed here, it's very clear. We're here to defend against a massive amount of violent rioters who are hiding terrorists behind them. They want to tear down the defenses and get inside, and our job as a military of a sovereign nation is to stop them and to defend our Israeli civilians.
Throughout the demonstrations, the IDF faced criticism at the UN, world capitals, and the media.
To the critics, I'd say stand in our shoes and walk in our boots a few miles, have those thousands of rioters and terrorists try to invade into your country and to risk or to threaten your civilians, and then criticize us.
Much of the coverage seemed to show one side of the story, an uprising to protest the opening of the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem. But Memory, the Middle East Media Research Institute, released a compilation of videos that give a much different perspective. For example, this Hamas official admitted on Palestinian television that 50 of the 62 people killed were Hamas members. Mahmoud Zahar, a senior Hamas official, said this on the Al Jazeera network.
This is a clear terminological deception. So when we talk about peaceful resistance, we're deceiving the public. This is a peaceful resistance bolstered by military force and by security agencies.
The videos show tire-burning and wire-cutting units saying their highest aspiration is to die for the sake of Allah, or to take down the border fence with the fingernails of their children. Israeli Ambassador Danny Danon called this a Palestinian cycle of death.
First, they incite people to violence. Then they place as many civilians as possible, including women and children, in the line of fire to maximize civilian casualties. Then they blame Israel, and then they come here to complain to the UN.
Even this Palestinian Authority official blamed the PA's rival, Hamas.
Seriously? Sending children to be killed or lose a limb while your leaders are having a good time?
More demonstrations are planned, and tragically, more Palestinian children may die or lose limbs and be crippled for life. After Hamas fired dozens of rockets into southern Israel, we went down to the Israeli town of Sderot, next to the Gaza Strip. Over the years, more than 10,000 rockets have been fired near or inside the town. Because of this danger, it's been called the bomb shelter capital of the world. Every home has a bomb shelter, and bus stops and playgrounds have them too. Given this kind of life, you might think the residents would have fled by now, but you'd be wrong. We talked with one resident who explained why Sderot has not only survived, but thrived.
It's even more incredible of a miracle that we're still alive and we're still here. And Sderot is a booming and thriving city. The rockets haven't scared anybody. In fact, the population is doubling. Everywhere you see cranes, you see construction, people from all over Israel are moving. You know, we're resilient. That's the word in this town, the theme, resilience. Resilience even in the light of 13,000 rockets from 2005 till today have been sent in the direction of this town, 13,000 rockets. And yet, do you see people screaming, running, packing up their moving trucks and moving out? They say no. In fact, you look in every direction. If you go to a high point and a viewpoint, you'll see cranes in every corner, apartments going up, new shopping malls, new businesses moving here. They say, we want to answer to Hamas. We want to show them we're not afraid. We're not leaving. You can march for return every day you want at the border, but we're here. We returned after 2,000 years of exile. God returned the Jewish people to this land. We're in the sovereign state of Israel. We're not occupying anybody. We're the Jewish people coming back to the biblical homeland, the land of Israel, and the modern miracle of the state of Israel.
Coming up, President Trump's historic decision to recognize Israeli sovereignty over the strategic land of the Golan Heights. The 26 nations of the European Union voted unanimously to condemn the U.S. decision to recognize Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. Yet during a meeting at the White House, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu called the move historic and one more action by President Trump that protects Israel from its enemies.
In the long sweep of Jewish history, there have been a handful of proclamations by non-Jewish leaders on behalf of our people in our land. Cyrus the Great Persian king, Lord Balfour, President Harry S. Truman, and President Donald J. Trump. And you, Mr. President, you've done it not once, but twice, with your bold proclamation on Jerusalem and with your bold proclamation today on the Golan. Your proclamation comes at a time when the Golan is more important than ever for our security, when Iran is trying to establish bases in Syria to strike at Israel. Mr. President, just as Israel stood tall in 1967, just as it stood tall in 1973, Israel stands tall today. We hold the high ground, and we shall never give it up. Ha'am im ha-Golan. That means the people are with the Golan. But thanks to you, we now know that there are two peoples who stand with the Golan.
The Golan Heights is part of Israel's biblical inheritance. It came back into Israel's hands as a result of the 1967 Six-Day War. For decades, it was one of Israel's quietest borders, but over the last few years, all that has changed. Take a look at the history and the strategic significance of the Golan to the Jewish state.
whoever sits on the Golan Heights totally dominates this whole region.
That's in part because of the proximity to the Sea of Galilee. The Golan Heights shares borders with Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon, and Damascus is only 40 miles away. For decades, Syria controlled the Golan Heights. Here on the high ground overlooking the Sea of Galilee, Syrian artillery and snipers shot and shelled Israelis below. Children grew up running to bomb shelters, and residents lived under the constant threat of attack.
So all along the line of this cliff were Syrian bunkers and military posts and cannons and artilleries. The communities beneath the Golan Heights were totally at the mercies of the Syrians.
Overlooking the Sea of Galilee, Middle East expert Avi Melamed told me why this ground is so important.
Now, you have to remember, the Sea of Galilee is the biggest fresh water body in Israel, providing something like 25-30% of the water consumption or the fresh water consumption in Israel. In 1948 until 1967, what happened was that the Syrians occupied some strategic areas. The major result of that was an enormously increasing pressure on Israel, mostly in the context of the water and the use of water.
Israel faced a literal uphill battle against the Syrian army, a rocky slope that rose 1,700 feet from the Sea of Galilee. Israel captured the Golan Plateau during the last 2 days of the Six-Day War.
We were afraid that Syria will come back. And again, they will shell the valley and try to take the water, to take the Jordan. We decided to make the first kibbutz in the Golan Heights.
And just a month after the war, Yehuda Harel and his family joined the first Israelis moving here.
We got a permission from the army to get inside the Golan Heights because it was a military area. And we got a job from them to collect cows that were wild in the area.
They first lived in what had been housing for Syrian army officers.
We are very near to Quneitra, about 100 meters from Quneitra, and we are near to the quarter that we used to live here for almost 5 years. This was the house that we, with another 3 families, lived in this house.
Eventually, the community moved across the ridge and still farms near the border. Today, close to 50,000 people, more than 25,000 Israelis, and about 22,000 Druze live on the Golan Heights. It's known for its fresh fruit, like the grapes used in award-winning Israeli wines.
In the last more than 40 years, the Golan Heights is the most quiet area of Israel. Everything happened in the other side of the border.
But that could be changing.
Do you see any similarities between the conditions prior to 1967 and the conditions now?
I would say that the strategic threat, as far as Israel is concerned, is today much more severe in comparison to the pre-1967. The major reason for that is that the presence of Iranians and Iranian-backed Shiite militias stone throw away from the Israeli-Syrian ceasefire line.
Melamed said Iran wants to establish a new front here, similar to those established in South Lebanon and the Gaza Strip.
Trying to launch a military front against Israel in the Golan Heights could result in a massive eruption, because Israel will not stand for that, and rightly so.
On the 49th anniversary of the Six-Day War, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu made it very clear how Israel views the Golan Heights.
They are for peace. In the stormy region around us, Israel is the stabilizing factor. Israel is the solution, not the problem. The Golan Heights will forever remain in Israel's hands. Israel will never come down from the Golan Heights.
For now, Harel says there's a reason why this area has remained quiet.
We live in peace. It's a peace because we are in the Golan Heights. When we were only in the valley and the enemy was up on the hill, it was not peace. To live in peace, you have to be strong and to live in the higher place.
Chris Mitchell, CBN News, the Golan Heights, Israel. Up next, CBN's film To Life, How Israeli Volunteers Are Changing the World, gets 2 Emmy nominations. CBN's documentary To Life, How Israeli Volunteers Are Changing the World, received 2 nominations for Daytime Emmys, one in the Outstanding Special Class series and the other for Outstanding Writing Special Class. Here's a look at one of the Israeli organizations highlighted in the film, Springs of Hope.
Today is a painful day for the Yazidis of Kurdistan. It's the 3rd anniversary of the genocide of their people. On August the 3rd, 2014, fighters from ISIS, or Daesh as they're called in Arabic, invaded the Sinjar region in northern Iraq, the ancestral home of the Yazidi minority. Some 200,000 Yazidis fled Sinjar. As many as 4,400 were massacred, and another 4,000 to 10,000 were kidnapped, forced to convert to Islam, tortured, and sold into slavery. Those who escaped are now scattered across Kurdistan, living in refugee camps. Today, they mark the beginning of their 4th year in exile. Some are weeping. Most are silent. All of them are wondering when the world will take notice. Standing with them is an Israeli woman who has dedicated her life to helping them however she can.
Who wants to intervene with a persecuted, unknown minority group in the Middle East? My conscience will not let me sit at home. Although out of my depth more than ever, I said I cannot walk away. Why the Yazidis? I ask myself questions and I don't have answers.
It was here in the Sharia refugee camp that Lisa got her first look at the women who had been kidnapped by ISIS.
We had worked since 2002 with victims of terror in Jerusalem, specifically widows and the younger kids that had fallen between the cracks. I had also been doing research for many years on the global funding of terror. It was 6 months after the beginning of the Yazidi genocide in Sinjar and Shingal, 3rd of August 2014. I begged, insisted, pleaded that we come up here, drove up to Sharia camp, walked around Sharia camp, flew back to Israel, and I was wrecked. I was just undone. I think I just jumped in pretty stupidly without knowing what I was jumping into, and realized that we had, as Israel, a small role to play regarding the women and the kids who are coming out of Daesh. I went into Sharia camp, which was then 22,000 and bursting at the seams, totally overwhelmed. If the UN can't cope, who are we to even dare to think that we can, a drop in the bucket? But when I began to meet the women that were coming out of Daesh and helping to take off their black robes and shower them and put a new dress on them, I realized that here we could help, and that would be our place of tikkun olam.
Coming up, Israeli archaeologists uncover a Jewish village in Jerusalem from the time of Jesus. Israeli archaeologists uncovered a Jewish suburb of Jerusalem from around the time of Jesus. Now it's located in an Arab neighborhood and was discovered as part of a salvage excavation. The ancient community likely interacted with pilgrims, and they provided goods for the Second Temple. CBN Middle East correspondent Julie Stahl has that story.
New building construction here often uncovers ancient treasures. That's the case in the Jerusalem neighborhood of Sharafat. This site was a Jewish village 2,000 years ago. Archaeologists uncovered it as they were preparing the site for a new elementary school.
The most spectacular find here is of a grand burial estate.
Archaeologist Yaakov Billig is heading this excavation, which today sits inside Jerusalem. Back then, this would have been more like a suburb.
The burial estate starts from a stepped long corridor going under a bridge like an overpass into a courtyard with a bench on one side and a bench on another side. Then from there upwards there was a covered entrance to the burial cave, and from then on inwards there's the underground burial cave.
Billig said the burial estate tells a lot about its owners.
The whole plan here belongs to some very important and or rich person with his family, possibly even for several generations.
They've also identified a Jewish ritual bath and much more.
We have evidence of the wine press with a very large treading floor where they placed the grapes. We also have an olive press. Between the wine and the olive oil, they probably had quite a high living standard here.
The best of the harvest was likely delivered to the temple, just an hour's walk away.
In the far right corner, you can see a small press that is the real virgin olive oil, which is probably the real top quality. I assume when the temple existed not far away, that went as a dedication to the temple. Thank you, God, for giving me the abundance of which I have now.
Billig said discoveries like this tell us much more about the people from that time.
They had probably a lot of interaction with the population of the city, maybe even for the pilgrims who made pilgrimage to the city. We can't forget that Jerusalem had to be supplied by produce of agricultural products, and here we have evidence of growing grapes, producing wine, growing olives, producing olive oil, growing pigeons, supplying the population with poultry, with eggs, also sacrifices for the temple.
As for what's ahead, a school is planned on the actual excavation site. Pottery fragments and other discoveries like this rare heart-shaped capital will be preserved off-site. Archaeologists hope the things that can't be moved will be preserved on the school grounds. Julie Stahl, CBN News, Sharafat, Jerusalem.
Well, that's just one more example of the archaeological evidence of Jewish life here in Jerusalem during the time of Jesus. Well, that's all for this edition. Thanks for joining us. Remember, you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. I'm Chris Mitchell. We'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline.